Welcome to Product AMA, your daily online Ask Me Anything. We started Product AMA to give those passionate or curious about product management a daily break, something to look forward to.
Our topic for today is scaling a global product with a billion users, billion with a B. And to tell us about the exciting journey, we have Matthew Izatt, who is a group product manager at Google and leads the Gmail product team. He has been with Google for just over 9 years now and was responsible for the Gmail redesign in 2018, the launch of the iOS and Android apps. So all of those amazing features that you see on Gmail, Matthew's team is the one behind them. We are so excited to have you, Matthew, on Product AMA. Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience and tell us an unknown, interesting fact about yourself?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. First off, let me say it's great, and thanks to the team for creating this forum. I certainly hope folks learn something interesting from the stories that I can tell, and I'm certainly looking forward to learning something back from the community. So thank you for hosting and setting this up. So background about myself, based in Toronto. I actually went to school here, have lived here my entire life, have traveled a lot. I've always enjoyed being based here, but working at companies which allowed me to engage with the world. I did an undergraduate degree in space science at York, and then a grad degree in computer science at York, and realized that grad school was getting too abstract for me. I wanted to try and do something that was more practical, had more of a real result. And so I started working, the first company I went to work for was a company called Platform Computing, a Toronto-based, I'd hesitate to call them a startup. It got up to about 400 people, profitable from day one. They were eventually bought out after I left by IBM. I described Platform, today you would think of what Platform does as being private cloud. That is cloud computing, but within the confines of a corporate network boundary. But back in the day, the concept of cloud didn't exist, so we called it grid computing or high performance computing. Now, talked about an unknown interesting fact about myself. I'll actually tie this into each of the places I worked. Platform hired me out of school to be a software developer, and I never actually became a software developer. I joined the company. I was ramping up on a new product that they had built, so I was doing something, a little bit of QA, a little bit of support, trying to learn the product before I was going to be a full-fledged developer. And after about a month, they said, we have a shortage of people to go out into the field and talk to customers. So would you like to go talk to customers? And there I was, a month out of school, knew how to write code, had never really talked to any customers in my life, and said, well, sure, why not? Lesson one, if you see an opportunity, say yes to it, good things usually happen. So I spent a lot of time on Platform in a sort of customer-facing, pre-sales, a little bit of post-sales role. Left Platform after 7 years and moved to another small Canadian company. It was about 10 or 20 years old at the time, called Certicom. Another company you probably haven't heard of. Certicom actually was a public company at the time, eventually bought by RIM, now BlackBerry. Certicom was very focused on encryption. Elliptic curve cryptography was the core capabilities of Certicom. We had a bunch of patents around it. And Certicom's biggest challenge was, how do you take a technology, elliptic curve cryptography, and turn that into a business? I used to like to joke that nobody wants to pay for math. And so my role there was to try and figure out how do we, in a given customer who had a need for high-end security, how do we come up with a solution that actually will be beneficial to them, profitable for us, and maybe lead into a long-term product? So I wasn't actually a product manager there. This is more of a consulting type or special projects role, but that was interesting. I eventually moved on to Google. I think you give a pretty good background there. I was the first launch of the Gmail iOS app. Eventually took on the Android Gmail app and rebuilt that. As you mentioned, responsible for the new Gmail launch, I guess going on almost 2 years ago now. And today I'm responsible actually for the G Suite platform, so our extensibility efforts, as well as our enterprise story for Gmail and our communications product. Now just go back to the one interesting fact. So platform, I applied and got a job, which I never actually did, software developer. I had the cards for years, even though I didn't do the job. When I went to interview at Certicom, my very first interview, the hiring manager I spoke to said, you don't seem like the right fit for this job. Doesn't sound like this will really interest you. But there's a guy down the hallway. He's looking for somebody that sounds much more interested, something that's much more interesting for you. And so I ended up with a much different job than what I interviewed for. So when I went to Google, I had 7 interviews in one day. We don't do that anymore. And every one of them asked me why I wanted to become a product manager at Google. And so in my experience with small companies, I immediately said, well, I'm pretty flexible. I'm interested in the intersection of business and technology, but it doesn't have to be a product manager. If you think it's a better job for me, I'm totally open to it. And 7 times in a row, they asked me the same question. I gave them roughly the same answer. Realizing now, I didn't realize then, but realizing now that all these folks were purely focused, it's a bigger company, so everybody's purely focused on, is this person a PM, yes or no? So they weren't going to recommend me for any other job, but so apparently they still were willing to hire me. So that was fortunate. But I guess the lesson there, always leave yourself open to opportunity.
Awesome. That's a great fact about yourself, Matthew. So let's get started off with the AMA. By knowing about how the landscape around Gmail has changed over the years, can you tell us about the industry as well as any trends that have been emerging recently?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the interesting things in our field is all around the explosion of messaging. And when I say messaging, I don't necessarily mean instant messaging and chat or any particular type of messaging. It's all the types of messaging communication, especially electronic communication, that have grown and evolved over the past few years. If you think of Gmail as a purely email product, you might also be in the mindset some people a few years ago were predicting the death of email, as if messaging and communication was a zero-sum game. If you send one less email, you'll send one more instant message. Ends up it doesn't really work that way. Anybody who's in almost any field of work, certainly knowledge workers, but almost any field of work is probably familiar with the explosion of messaging. You probably now get emails. You probably are direct messaging with people. Maybe you're using WhatsApp. I wouldn't be surprised you're not a number of Slack channels, some of which may be related to your work teammates. People still call you on the phone. Doesn't happen a lot in my job, but sometimes I'm surprised and somebody actually dials my telephone the old-fashioned way. They schedule video chats with me. And all of these things are growing simultaneously. And so to me, and to my team, one of the most interesting things here and one of the most interesting problems to solve is how do we help everyone deal with this explosion of incoming communications? They all serve an important purpose. I mean, they wouldn't exist if not for that. But how do we help you deal with that so you're not just overwhelmed, right? Like 7 years ago, you might have said, oh, I'm overwhelmed by the amount of email. Now you're overwhelmed by the amount of email and chats and group chats and meetings and phone calls and. And so if we look at this, it's how do we help you figure out what's the right mode of communication? Are you trying to reach somebody? Do you need an answer now? Do you need an answer later? Are you trying to write short form? Is this long form or formal communications? Is this a small audience or big audience? Are you talking one person? Are you talking with your immediate teammates who work with you every day? Or are you trying to talk to everybody at a location? I'll tell you that in our office, we have a person who's responsible for the general health and well-being of the overall office, so all the teams that happen to be in the office. And he often makes the comment that he doesn't know how to reach everybody anymore. If he sends an email, do they all read it? What if he puts it on chat? If he posts it on Google Plus? There are all these places. How does he get the audience to pay attention to the things they should pay attention to? And that involves another part of communication, which some things are must know, can you please accomplish this task tomorrow? And some things it'd be great if everybody knows, but it's not super important. If you go on holiday and you happen to miss the message, it doesn't matter that much. So all of these trends in communication lead to a question of communication overload, and how do we help people with that? And that's, to me, one of the most interesting problems and one of the things that my team, my broader team, focuses on.
All right. And when Gmail, if I'm not wrong, it has over 1.5 billion users worldwide. And when your product has so many users, all the eyes of the senior leadership would be on it. So how do PMs in such a case manage stakeholders effectively?
Yeah, the number is big enough that I lose track of what the actual number is at any given point in time. I just know it's big. Um, I think there's two types of stakeholders you think about, and they're the internal stakeholders, which you'll often think of the people inside the company and your direct, your customers directly. There's a bunch of external stakeholders, and let me touch on those separately. Um, Internal stakeholders, users, customers, that isn't actually that much different in a billion user product than it is in a 100-user product. You're trying to get your first product, right? You've got your core product team, engineering team, design team, go to market and sales. Yes, they scale at a billion users, but fundamentally, the ways in which you involve those folks doesn't change that much. Right? You still want to be exceedingly close to your engineers and your design team, and being able to brainstorm together solutions to problems. You want to understand what it looks like in customers' hands or in end users' hands, and how you're going to market with that with those products. Those things are actually pretty similar. As a company gets larger, obviously communicating upwards becomes more interesting and different. If you're a startup and your boss is the CEO, it's relatively easy to walk into the office and have casual chats. If you're in a much bigger company and there's someone 3 levels above you who has 10,000 people to think about, then you have to be much more concise in your communications, right? You have to bring them only the important information, the things you either need them to know or things you need them to make a decision upon, where they can help you get something done. In an ideal situation, they're able to devolve power down to yourself to actually accomplish things without micromanaging. Because if you have 10,000 people, you're not going to micromanage anything. Those things I think aren't all that different for a billion user product versus a 10 user product. One of the biggest differences with a billion user product is the set of external stakeholders that most folks don't think about. That is, when I was at a small company, if we made a mistake, something crashed, the system was down for a little bit, like, yes, that was really bad. We could lose customers, lose revenue. You never want that to happen. If you do that when you are in a billion user product, not only can all those other bad things happen, but you will trigger a media storm. People will make snarky remarks about you on Twitter. Like the brand value that people associate with you will go down. Like, I think Gmail's brand value is very strong, partly because we do a pretty good job. I'm not gonna say perfect, but a pretty good job making sure that Gmail is up. Like, if Gmail goes down, that is shocking news. It just doesn't happen. There's political and regulatory concerns that you have to think about because you're on the radar of a large volume of people. And whether you're the EU or the US Congress, you don't necessarily think about small startups, but something happens to a billion user product or there's a privacy concern, like these things attract those sort of attentions. You're a big target for fraud and abuse, again, because you're just a much more interesting target for those folks. So the set of stakeholders is much different in that case. It's more of those external stakeholders that are very different from the billion user product.
Awesome. Really like the point you mentioned about PR. It doesn't take more than 5 minutes for it to become news, especially when products like Facebook or Google their services are down, and it instantly reflects on the news feed. All right. To those of you who have just joined us, we are chatting with Matthew, who's a group product manager at Google, works on Gmail, leads the Gmail team, and feel free to ask your question. It's an Ask Me Anything, so feel free to drop your questions in the Zoom chat and I'll pick them up very soon. All right, Matthew, so we all know about the Gmail redesign, which came out a couple of years back. A lot of user research might have gone into the process of revamping the product. Since the product is used by a variety of users across the world, how do you make sure that you're learning about users with different needs, behaviors, and demographics and covering all those aspects?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a number of things that we do. Maybe I'll give some brief comments about those and give an example. So I don't think these things are necessarily special to a billion user product, although we have the scale to perhaps do more of them. So we do a range of things. We will build prototypes and try them out ourselves, as well as try them out with small user groups. So we'll try and make sure that our user groups are representative of different populations and different segments of our audience. But we'll try them out with small groups just to see how people respond to different ideas. We will launch things to get early feedback from dog fooders, basically internal users who use something before it's completely ready. We have concepts of alpha and previews that we invite people to join. We do user studies at various scales. Some of them are practical user studies, like, hey, given this piece of product, if we asked you to accomplish this task, can you do it? As well as broader ones, like understanding your communications need. Who do you speak to most often? What do you find the biggest weaknesses in your communications tool set? So we do a lot of things like that. Let me give a specific example, for example, from the new Gmail. You might be familiar with the fact that the new Gmail has a set of layout options. They're previously cozy, compact, and comfortable, and now there's default, cozy, and comfortable. And so you might wonder, how did we come up with exactly a set of 3? Why wasn't it 5? Why aren't there sliders and you can adjust 17 different things? There are a bunch of factors that went into thinking about that. And those control a few things. They control things like line spacing. And I'll just, for the sake of simplicity, I'll just think about web for the moment. There's similar concepts on mobile, but just to narrow down the discussion. So on web, you can imagine line spacing. So like, how many lines of text do you see? There are some people who like to have a lot of very dense information on the screen and can parse that very easily. And there's a lot of people for whom scannability is important. And, you put too much information on the screen, it's actually very hard to scan. And there's lots of studies showing that there's a range of different ways in which people are able to process information. There's additionally things like how much snippet should we show? So we show like the sender and the subject, and then we show some amount of text from the actual message. We also, in the new Gmail, added something we call the attachment chips, which is essentially a very tiny direct link into any attachments, so that you can click directly through attachments from the list of messages. There's a few other things that are controlled here, but essentially a concept of like scannability and information density. And so how do we figure out that 3 is the right number, and these particular 3 should be the correlation? So first off, you can imagine at the end, or the greatest possible scale is that we could have one control which controls line height. And you can make your line height 1.0, 1.01, and 1.02, and 1.03. Then we'd have attachment chips, and how many do you want there? And how wide do you want everything? We could have a whole lot of controls there. And there's a set, again, going back, there's a set of people for whom it would be great to have 17 controls and they can customize exactly as they like it. And there's a significant set of people for whom if I gave them 17 controls, they would just leave it, because they would have, if you ever analysis paralysis, they would have analysis paralysis, like, I don't know what to do all these controls, and I just want to read my mail and get stuff done. I don't want to spend my time configuring software. That's not what I do with my life. So there's a medium there that we're trying to draw. So we did a number of studies. We did quantitative data analysis. We looked at, in the existing Gmail, how many people had their, for certain settings, how many people settings on and off. So what had people chosen and how was it different from the default? We created a whole bunch of mocks, so visual prototypes of various different configurations. And we asked a representative sample of folks which ones they liked, like which ones worked for them and why. We also did some, I'll call it baseline research on just why people prefer more or less density of information, what types of information they need. Like how, for example, attachment chips, people might like density of information, but they don't click on them very often, therefore, is it really useful? So we put all that together, and we were able to find a constrained set of 3 that more or less matched, if you call it a classic 80-20 rule. We were able to get, most people were going to be pretty happy with one of those choices. And then we defaulted to the one that we felt was going to have the largest set of folks who would like it. But there was a whole lot of testing and iteration that went on in trying to figure that out.
Yeah, and I would shortly come to testing, but we do have a couple of questions from the audience. So first of all, Lee is asking a follow-up question on the communication overload problem. So he's asking, how does your team use segmentation or personas to understand the usage of different channels? Are there demographic and geographic differences, or do you look more at the jobs to be done?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we do use personas very often in trying to understand users. One of the challenges if you're a billion user product is how many personas do you create? Right? I like to joke that Gmail has a billion users and a billion different ways of using it. But we do try and aggregate into like a small number of personas, and our UX research staff does a pretty good job of trying to define these categories of people. And we, to answer the latter part of that, very often by more how they look from a productivity point of view, a little bit less based on pure geography. So like a persona might be a knowledge worker who receives an average of N emails a day, writes an average of Y emails a day, communicates with an average set of, their average set of people they communicate with is this. Their working set, like the things they're trying to work on at one time is of this size. And then we end up like 5 or 6 of these personas. And the way we use those is to reason through. And, you start by brainstorming a whole bunch of ideas. Like here's the whole range of things we can do to solve problem X. And then you think of, for this persona, how would it work with this person? And these are still theoretical exercises, right? So if you can, the secret sauce of product manager is to try and reason it well enough that the things you take to a more formalized user study are probably close, or it's a small enough set that you can actually test it, right? If you were to have to test everything you ever brainstorm, you would be here forever and produce nothing. So you have to narrow down the problem size small enough that you can run user studies on it, do actual prototypes, and then narrow it down further. That's a long-winded way of saying yes, we use personas.
Awesome. And another question around dog fooding. So with such a big team under your supervision, how do you go about handling leaks, especially when prototyping or when dog fooding? What can you do to like prevent these leaks?
I mean, you can never absolute prevent leaks. I think the other thing I'll say is, at least in my part of the world, we're relatively fortunate in that there's almost nothing we're doing that if it were to leak, it would create the business is not going to go under. Individual humans aren't going to be harmed physically in any way because something leaked. So it's not like if you leaked the identity of a spy, that'd be really bad. So the downside of something leaking are mainly constrained to the inability of us to tell our story. And so what do I mean by that? Gmail's, it's a billion user product. Everybody's intensely interested. And if somebody leaks a snippet of a document without the rest of the context, people will start writing stories and draw huge conclusions, which may be completely incorrect. And then, going back to my talk about external stakeholders, we'll get a letter from, from some regulatory body somewhere saying, I saw it. We've seen media reports saying that Gmail's doing this really awful thing. And to which our response is, no, we haven't even done anything yet. We're like, you took an out of context snippet where somebody misinterpreted and then are asking us about it, something we haven't even actually done. So downsides are more something like that. Honestly, we still try to take the trust our teammates approach. We try to explain to folks why it is important that we are able to tell the story of what we are doing rather than letting someone else who doesn't understand it tell the story. But still, I think a founding ethos of the companies from the area I work is if we hire a bunch of smart people and give them all the information to their jobs, they'll do a good job. And so in most cases, at least in my part of the world, if somebody asks me, how much effort should we put into making sure something leaks, I'll say let's try and tell people not to leak it. But I'd rather we do a great job and build something great than be a little bit less likely to leak.
Awesome. And Matthew, I'm curious to know, do you run tests or experiments on Gmail? And how do you do that and ensure that the sample size is large enough to represent the views of a majority of users?
Yeah, my team. So definitely my team will know the answer to this because one of the things I drill into anyone who joins my team, and this is foundational to being a billion user product, we don't experiment on our users, at least in the sense of that word. We will certainly run like, as I said, prototypes and pre-release tests, and maybe try out things in internal or alphas that we're not 100% sure of, but we almost never do something in like full production to an average user that we don't think is something we actually want to launch. I mean, this goes back to like, Gmail is a productivity tool. We're a productivity team, and you know, there are many pieces of software that are more entertainment based. You'd be really disappointed if they weren't working, but they would end there, right? Your entertainment stops. If your productivity tool is not working, and someone is using it to get their job done, to do something in their life, that's a different kind of expectation. And so we try pretty hard not to necessarily test or experiment on production users. Almost all of our testing is it's pre-release. Maybe another other side example of that is there's things like, I don't know, infrastructure changes where we can do A/B tests of things which might improve latency. So like we are always interested in making sure that the app is more responsive, uses less memory, less CPU. From the moment you click a button to the moment something happens, that those things are great. And those are areas where we can actually do an A/B test because there isn't necessarily user harm, and a lot of these things those sort of things need to be tested at scale. You can have a theoretical idea of what will improve latency, but in a real world environment with users all over the world, all sorts of different devices, sometimes the results are different.
Awesome. We have another question from the audience. Another one from Lee, who's asking it, what kind of challenges have you had with internal alignment around roadmaps, cross-product integrations, and marketing launches? Are there any unique processes to ensure alignment that are used in such a large organization?
I don't know if there's anything that's unique per se. There's a little bit more formality required. I think in a very small company, there is one CEO/founder who might be setting an overall vision, and can probably in their heads keep track of everything that everyone's doing. Maybe not the micromanagement level, but like know all the major projects that are going on, and very quickly make decisions when there's a trade-off between two possible priorities. That part is much harder at a larger company. So you tend to be more formal about making those trade-offs. The kind of conflicts you would see at a larger company are not so much like bad people who completely oppose each other, but that in a very large company, you can have folks with different missions, and sometimes those missions can try and do things that either detract from somebody else's mission, or chew up resources that another side might want. So I mean, some of the ways that we try and avoid that, generally through formality. One is through a process called OKRs, objectives and key results. On a regular basis, every team tries to write down what their goals are and what the things are that they're going to accomplish that will achieve those goals, and we roll those. It's both an upwards and downwards process, so that as you roll upwards, you're able to see if there's any misalignments. Like, oh, if this one team wants to, I'm blanking on a good example here, but like there can be cases where just the teams are doing things which are totally in opposition to each other. 3 teams want to build a new operating system. That's probably not a great idea. And so doing that, as well as a pretty formal design, both engineering and product design, like documentation process. So make sure you write down what you plan to do. Make sure you go to potentially a review committee composed of peers and all the stakeholders, and make sure that they are both aware of and agree with what's happening. And people disagree, that's natural, and make sure you resolve those disagreements before you end up building something.
Awesome. And you touched a bit about OKRs, and I have a question for you regarding, what do you track? How do you define? So like, talking about measuring success for a well-adopted product, could you like describe how do you go on defining those objectives and key metrics that you track? And what do you track on a frequent basis for Gmail?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I'll start by tracking back to I talked about us being in the productivity space. So there's a lot of, maybe contrast that to the entertainment space. And so a lot of people, when they think about software and they think about the apps on their phone, a lot of them bias towards the entertainment space. And it's like, how much time did somebody spend in the app? Did more people tap more buttons in my app and tell more of their friends, therefore inviting more of them, therefore getting more usage? Productivity apps are interesting in that our end goal is to help make people more productive, which means, broadly speaking, you're either helping somebody do the same thing in less time or do more things at the same time. Right? And so in some ways, it's almost the opposite of entertainment app. We don't care at all how much time you spend in our app. If we could get the amount of time spent in Gmail, if you can accomplish all the same tasks you do today and get the amount of time you spend in Gmail down to like 1 minute a day, that'd be totally fine by us because it means you're being more productive. So we measure two main things. One is they're totally qualitative, which is user perception and customer perception of happiness. Are you happy with the product? And then people aren't happy. You can devolve that into it was too slow. Something was broken. I couldn't accomplish something I was trying to do. But broadly speaking, aggregate that all into happiness, and then like happiness with individual pieces of it. The other one is, as I said, we don't measure necessarily like time in app, but we do measure general adoption. So adoption can be both usage as well as revenue from our paying enterprise customers. And I think there's as a general top-level truism, if you are happy and the app is making you more productive, you are more likely to use it and pay for it. And again, I don't care if you spend, in fact, if you spend twice as much time as you were before in our app, that's probably a bad sign, because unless you're accomplishing more than twice as many things. But if you are willing to pay for it because it helps you in your daily life, that's a really good sign.
All right, great. I see a lot of great questions from the audience, and please keep asking your questions. We're at the halfway mark, and I'm just gonna pick up a couple of questions here. So we have a question from Vinay, who's asking, how much can people from your team experiment with respect to launching new features? Do you roll out such experimental features in any specific test market? And how do you choose such market?
Yeah, so again, going back to my statement of we don't necessarily experiment on end users. We're like, anybody in the team can propose a new feature that they'd like to see. They can prototype it in-house, like roll it out to the team, no problem, but basically no approvals. If you want to try something with the team, you'd be like, hey, I got this cool new thing. Press this. You most commonly will say, press this button here to try it out. Sometimes people will build to make it easier. Sometimes they'll build like a Chrome extension or an add-on or something to have a prototype that is easier to build and easier to try out. If we want to take a step further, that's when we start talking. Talked about doing UX research. That's when we start taking it to actual users outside of the bubble of our employees and seeing what their reaction is. Finding out if this is both useful from a product point of view as well as has some market value. The audience that we would go to really depends on what the feature is. If you are building a feature that's narrowly focused on, Fortune 1000, like large Fortune 1000 companies, then that's a very different market than if you were building a feature which automatically offers to translate email between two languages. So the market you'd go after would really highly depend. The advantage of being a pretty large company with a lot of resources is that we have the capability to find, depending on what your target audience is, we generally have the capability to find a test audience to validate your idea.
And talking about rapidly testing business ideas, is there still a sprint process developed by Knapp and Rzatsky, the design sprint. How is it used by your team, and is it continuous or ad hoc?
Yeah, it's fun. I always find it funny that a number of people ask me about generally speaking agile at Google. I'll say a couple of things. One is that Google as a company is not prescriptive about exactly what development process you follow. So it's very much up to the individual teams. The teams that I've been on, I generally describe as using an agile-like process. And I generally think of my product management style as being agile-like as well. We don't use any of the named processes. So while I know what a sprint is, we almost never call it a sprint. We are very close to I'll attempt to framing the question, I'll attempt to call it ad hoc, primarily process. I suppose the ultimate way to think of agile, the way I think of the way we do it is, at any given point in time, you can revisit whether you're doing the right thing and refocus on what you're doing in the next week, month, etc. So folks often ask me, what's your plan look like for 5 years, 3 years? And I can tell them roughly what I would imagine the future would look like, but I have never ever said this is our plan because it's what we said 3 months ago or 6 months ago. Our plan is correct because it still looks correct according to the conditions that we have today.
All right, and we've talked a lot about testing ideas, experimentation, testing it or experimenting it with your own team. But let's come to releases. Being such an integral product in a user's life, if one thing breaks, it can lead to a bad user experience for millions of users. So how do you manage releases for your product?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I've talked about a billion user products. You can't fail. Failure is not an option. Breaking is not an option. Not to suggest that we are perfect. We're always striving to get as close to 100% as we can. I mean, let me list out, if I can remember, all the different things that we do. Hopefully, going from like beginning to end. So, like at the very earliest part of the process, we have code reviews and design reviews. That is, no one goes off into a corner, writes 3,000 lines of code and 2 new features, and then says, "All right, I'm ready to launch it." Everything is run through a design review process. Like, how do you plan to build? How it's going to work into our relatively complicated system? And as they're writing the code, it is reviewed by a peer as it is checked in an ongoing basis. We very heavily, I was going to say encourage, but perhaps enforce is a better frame of reference. Automated testing. That is a significant portion of the time that our engineers spend writing code, is also writing test code to ensure that the code continues to work. And what I mean by that is, if you suppose you create a new button and has a couple states, you will also write an automated test that presses that button and checks that the result was the thing that you expected would happen. And so the result of that is, if you have, you imagine like huge numbers of these test cases having been written, the engineer who starts moving around some buttons and changing things because, I don't know, we knew visual design or something, all of these automated tests will double check these things still work, even if that engineer who 3 years later has no idea exactly how these things work. If they make a mistake that breaks something, they'll find out almost immediately. So it's automated continuous testing. We have manual testing as well. You can't test everything automatically, and there's certainly creative test scenarios you can build up. I mentioned talking about alpha, beta, dog food, putting it in front of real users. We also do canarying in production. Example of that, if you have ever been excited about a new feature in Gmail, probably any Google product, I'll use Gmail as the reference. You saw a blog post and it said, "Great new feature in Gmail," and usually the media drops this part at the bottom of our blog post. They almost always say, "Starting to roll out today." Never says available today. It always says something like, starting to roll out day X, and sometimes we say it'll take a week or two, because basically everything we roll out is a percentage launch. We'll launch it to 0.1%, and then 1%, and then percentages above that. And the idea there, again, is suppose every one of these other tests failed, and still something bad happens. We want to be able to catch that before it goes out to everyone. And so we have automated monitoring of the systems. So we know roughly how many emails are sent over time, and if that suddenly changes by a large percentage, an alert will go off and someone will look at it. We have things like rollback safety. So that's the idea that if you launch something, not only do you need to make sure it's safe to launch, you need to make sure it's safe to unlaunch in case something goes wrong. So let me give an example there. Suppose for some infrastructure reason you had to, you're changing database formats. And you could imagine doing that two ways. One, the client could blow away the old database and then create a new one and sync the information down from the server. Now the problem with that one is when you're creating the new database, if it fails for some reason, like the information, you messed up the protocol, you messed up the database creation command, something went wrong, you're in big doo-doo, right? Because the old database, you blew it away first. But you can do it the other way around, which is you create the new database, add all the information into it on the client, and then blow away the old database. Then you're safe, because if the new one doesn't work, you just immediately go back to the old one. So that's like a very simple example of rollback safety. The other thing that we have is an entire class of jobs called SRE. If you've never thought about it, it's basically service reliability engineering. A set of super smart folks whose, they will probably have a better job definition for themselves than I do. But essentially, they spend all their time thinking about what are all the possible failure scenarios and how do we guard against them? How do we build a really resilient system to make sure that there is, like, humans make mistakes. We need to have defense in depth. How do we make it such that no one mistake, and preferably no two mistakes, by anybody anywhere can actually cause a serious problem?
All right. And like in other products by Google, I frequently see different versions. So I see different icons on YouTube on my phone than my friend's phone. Do you do that type of do you keep those kinds of versions on Gmail as well to like just try it out different user interfaces or experiences?
Generally not. I agree. Like again, if I'll call YouTube an entertainment tab, I'm sure they'd come with better classification. But there are things you feel comfortable doing on an entertainment app that you don't feel as comfortable doing on a productivity app. So I think our bar for like testing, or like what you might call testing or experimenting on use, especially in production, is we are far less tolerant of doing something like that. It doesn't mean we have to be like far more careful before we push things out, because it's a productivity app. If you have to spend hours adjusting to a change and then not more hours adjusting back to a change, you're going to be less productive. And so we want to be very cognizant of that.
I have an interesting question here from the audience. Irshad is asking that coming to automated tests, for example, if a developer writes a G-test suite for his feature, how do you ratify that these tests are relevant to the jobs to be done? Will there be any data insights to rely on from customers always?
It's probably getting a little bit away from, the level at which I pay particularly close attention to. I almost feel like there's a better question to maybe a suggestion for another AMA is actually to find a senior engineer for everything that a product person would want to know.
For sure.
I'm just not trying to give a satisfying answer to that question.
Okay. Have you seen any changes in the user behavior during the pandemic lockdown? And have you had insights into the future trends with an increase in remote work?
I'm not sure if they're future trends anymore. Right now, they're current trends. I mean, definitely there's been changes in user behavior. The bigger changes, if I think about G Suite as opposed to thinking about, like, let's say Gmail, and you see it in public numbers, like the explosion, exactly what we're doing now, right? It's like explosion, like absolute explosion in video conferencing and video calling. And you might even say, well, what does a Gmail PM care too much about that? As like, we're part of a broader team, which is the G Suite team, like all the product tools together. Microsoft, of course, has Office 365 and their set of their set of tools. One of the ways in which as a larger company you can react to this is when you see usage of something going up 10x, 20x, 30x, you don't have to think about just that team helping out. You've got a wider team that can help out. And so like when people like overnight, it's not literally overnight, but like it's overnight in the sense of how you do product planning. People started adopting video conferencing, Google Classroom, like basic e-learning also went up by like enormous factors, like orders of magnitude. When you see that, you can pull people and machine resources onto improving that. So, if you imagine, we talked about site reliability. Like people think of the cloud as being some amorphous thing where, oh, something grows 10x. Of course, you just press the button that says I want 10x as many resources and I pay a little bit more. That doesn't necessarily work at world scale systems like whether it's Zoom or Google Meet. They're using up enough resources that you actually have to go around and make sure you have enough machines. And so it's the impact of user behavior on back-end infrastructure and the decisions you make as a team as to where to invest in the next few weeks have changed a lot. So I think the change in behavior, the most dramatic ones are in those things that were previously online and went offline. Like I said, meetings, e-learning, those are the two most dramatic ones. The impact to something like email and chat was there, like it was an increase in electronic communication because things that may have happened in person. But there's already a lot of chat and email and text communication happening anyways. So the rise there wasn't as dramatic as it had been in those other things where there just wasn't as much, where it was like a wholesale replacement of an in-person function.
All right. And another question related to this, how do you see the future, or what do you see as the future of the email product? And what is Gmail's role in this category?
Yeah, I think I touched upon that. I think in the very first question about like the trends in the industry. I think we see a bright future in electronic communication is not going away. There is a if you think about electronic communication, you say, oh, email, because email is somehow totally distinct from instant messaging, which is totally distinct from group messaging, which is totally if you think of all these things as totally distinct, then you'll have one answer. I think our view is these things aren't totally distinct, and so the future that we see is more around integrated communications. How do you help people find the right channel and deal with that information overload with basically all those requests for communication happening across all those channels? Fundamentally, people are adopting them because they make them more productive, but doesn't mean by any stretch that they are perfect and that there aren't major gains for productivity that we can make in the future.
All right. And there's a question around, once you get to 1.5 billion users, where do you go from there?
1.6. I don't think any of us ever looked at our job role as being purely about get more users until you run out of people. It's an interesting challenge, right? Because getting that last person is going to be really hard. It's going to be somebody who doesn't even have internet access. But I don't think none of us view that as being the purpose of Gmail or the purpose of our roles. In many ways, it goes back to productivity. It's how can I make the set of users that we have even more productive? Have I done my job better if I make 1.5 billion users twice as productive, or if I get us to 3 billion users? In some ways, I'd argue that making those 1.5 billion more twice as productive is a probably more impactful thing that our team could work on. And if we succeed at that, then we'll probably end up with more users as a byproduct. But from a pure like just looking at the numbers, they are great numbers. It is exciting. It's a reflection of I think some of the value that we bring. Nobody is ever forced to choose our product. They had to, generally speaking, make an active choice to do so. So it's great. But we see it more of a reflection of the value that we're bringing rather than as a goal in and of itself.
All right. So we're almost at time here. I'll ask you a last few questions. Talking about general product management, how do you measure success of a product manager?
Success of a product manager. Sometimes with my teams, we talked about OKRs. Sometimes with my teams, I tell them that is almost indistinguishable. Their personal OKRs and their team OKRs. So sometimes there'll be things on personal OKRs, which are like, I don't know, improve my communication skills, or give 5 talks at a large conference, or improve my writing, or something like that. But fundamentally, it's almost the buck stops here, right? If your product succeeds, you probably were doing the right things. If your product doesn't succeed, well, you may have been doing the right things and you were in an impossible situation. That's very possible. But ultimately, there is some expectation the product manager should be judged by the success of their product. I mean, that's sort of fundamental in the name. You are the manager of the product. You should have the widest overview of the success of the product of anyone. So, like in my case, I sort of look at it as all problems are mine. I might be the product manager, but if the biggest problem my product has is, I don't know, recruiting engineers, I will go out and pitch engineers. So my team sometimes will use me when we're recruiting people to sort of give a talk about why they should come to our team. My biggest problem is our marketing's not doing well, our brand positioning, like whatever our biggest problem is, I should be participating on it to solve it. So in some ways, like the success of the product manager is very much contingent on the success of the product. Now, if you're managing a team, you should, of course, look at the behaviors of a person and help them improve, whether it's communication, writing, interpersonal negotiating, like work on those aspects to become a better individual and a better product manager as a result.
And is there something key about product management that you have learned along the way and has been a critical success factor for your own career?
Well, I mean, success factor career might be completely independent of being a PM, as I mentioned, is just to be open to opportunity. And so open opportunity is like recognize opportunity and jump into it. And then just being willing to accept opportunity when others around you volunteer something. So like one example of the latter is, actually one example of the latter, I was product manager of Gmail iOS, and large company through a reorg Android Gmail, which didn't happen to be organizationally close to me, it did become organizationally close to me. And my boss looked around and said, you seem to know what you're doing. I don't have anybody else for this. Were you interested? And my answer was, well, yeah, I'd love to work on that. This is a number of years ago, but I'd love to work on Android Gmail. There's some other things I think we could do there. But it was like, and turns out we could do some really interesting things and try to be a great choice. But it was, an opportunity was there, and I said yes to it. I think that's one of the probably best things for anyone's career is to be just open to the idea of opportunities when they arise.
And what are some of the best books or resources that you would recommend to our audience here and to PMs who are trying to build successful and great products?
So I'll say one thing. I think I always feel like I've learned more from my peers, especially my peers in other functions, than I've learned from any book anywhere else. There's nothing like seeing people in their roles in action. I have learned so much by attending sales conferences and seeing being surrounded by a bunch of salespeople and seeing how they think and how they plan for the year, and then sitting on engineering and design conferences and being surrounded by lawyers and working through contracts and sort of saying, oh, so that's what you find interesting in a contract, or what the things I should learn and look for. So to me, those have been the absolute best ones. To give some examples of things that you can also go buy in a store, online. A course that I was lucky enough to get to take, which was coming by a book. book, actually. Stuart Diamond, I think, is professor, I forget which university it is, but he's professor at American University, who teaches, I think his book was called Getting More. And the course is about negotiation. And the book was about negotiation. And, despite being a relatively full-size book with a bunch of aspects to it, to me it really got across just one key point that I've always remembered, which was understand what the person across from you is interested in and wants. There's these books that describe negotiations, zero-sum game, you get more, they get less. This one's definitely more on the win-win side, but essentially, if you can put yourself in somebody else's shoes and understand what they really want, then you can negotiate out a solution which hopefully gets closer to what they want and still delivers what it is that you're interested in. Because very often, in some cases it's like there's a $1 coin and there's only one of them. It's hard to negotiate that out, but like very often there's apples and oranges, right? And you can figure out what apples they want, what oranges you want. You're in great shape. I also pay attention to TechMeme, which is an aggregator site. I find it interesting because it shows up a combination of like tech news as well as tech opinion articles from a range of authors. I like to see a diversity of opinions, so it's always interesting. There's a range of different authors that will end up getting posted up near the top of TechMeme. I always like Stratechery as an example of one that sometimes shows up there, but to which I will read sometimes. It goes back to my interest of the intersection of technology and business.
Awesome. And I resonate so much with what you said about negotiations and understanding the perspective of the other party, because that's something that even I took a course on negotiation during my MBA, and that was the core of any negotiation simulation or exercise that we did. One last question before we wrap up. This is another audience question regarding Gmail. Except prompting email content while users start typing email, are there any other areas where you're using AI or ML?
I guess that one's the most visible example. Without Smart Compose, you start writing something, and then we suggest how you might want to complete your sentence. Other examples, a thing called Smart Reply, which is sort of like an earlier version of Smart Compose, which is you'll see often you'll see 3 buttons at the bottom of an email. You now see this. A lot of other apps have other versions of this, including Google Apps and non-Google apps will offer 3 quick reply options. You can tap quickly, yes, I'd love to, kind of thing. The categorization that you see in Gmail. So if you have the tabs on primary, social, promotions, that's actually a learning system. Like it started out with a set of basic heuristics, and then it learns from actions that people take. A system you would pay no attention to, wouldn't even think about, our spam system. This very much uses a number of machine learning aspects to it. Essentially, spam's an interesting one because it's an adversarial game, right? There's an adversary on the other side who's trying to figure out how to defeat your system so they can potentially commit fraud on end users. And so there's a bunch of interesting machine learning systems there. There's probably some other examples that I haven't thought of, but there's a ton of non-obvious places where we try to apply machine learning.
Yeah, another obvious one I can think of is the follow-up notification that you get. If you have sent an email and you want to follow up with it, follow up with the person after like 3 or 5 days.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Matthew, for those great insights. It was lovely chatting with you and hosting you. Some really good insights and learnings coming out of it. And everyone, take care, stay safe, enjoy the rest of your day, and enjoy the coming weekend.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Follow Product AMA on Twitter and send us your topic suggestions. We look forward to seeing you soon.